very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. God bless you. Bye-bye.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and welcome to Minhaj Welfare Foundation's live online Q&A with the Right Honourable Stephen Timms, who we are very privileged that he joins us, I think, from his home at this very moment of time. This is a live Q&A with Stephen Timms. The title of the program is Quarantine, Economic Crisis and the Impact on Low-Income Families. It's a very lengthy discussion. And we are very honored that Stephen joins us today in this live Q&A session.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for joining us. Just a brief about Stephen for our viewers and those that have joined us live on Facebook. The Right Honourable Stephen Timms is the MP for East Ham. He has been an MP for many years now, and he's a very good friend of Minhaj. He's also the Labour Party's faith envoy. He was the Shadow Minister for Employment from 2010 until September 2015. Stephen first entered Parliament in 1994. He's held a number of ministerial posts under the previous Labour government, including Chief Secretary to the Treasury and Financial Secretary to the Treasury. Before entering Parliament, Stephen worked in telecommunications industry for 15 years. He's got a very prolific experience within government, within Parliament, and we are very honoured that Stephen is now the chair for the Select Committee for the Works and Pensions Committee, which is a very distinguished privilege that he holds at this very current moment of time. And I'm sure Stephen will be able to tell us more about his role as an MP during this time, and hopefully about the Select Committee hearing today that happened in the morning. So first of all, Stephen, thank you so much for joining us. Good evening, all the way from, I think, East Ham?
From East Ham, that's right. No, I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Stephen, as you're well aware, it's a very strange situation that we're all facing right now with the quarantine, with COVID-19. There's a massive frenzy across the UK, and a lot of people are worried. We are isolated. How is life for MPs at this moment in time?
Well, Parliament is meeting again this week. We had our Easter break, and then we returned on Tuesday, but in a very strange way. So the way it's working, as you've probably seen, is that there's a handful of members of Parliament in Westminster, with others taking part virtually using technology like this. So today, you mentioned the meeting of my Select Committee today. This morning, we had a 2.5-hour session, public session from 9:30 to 11:30. And all the MPs taking part, including me, were taking part from home. And Parliament has never done anything like this before. Some people have had to work really hard to make it happen in time, but it worked very well. We used Zoom, and everybody was able to have their say, to ask their question. The ministers gave their answers. We had 3 ministers taking part, plus 2 senior officials from the Department for Work and Pensions. So it worked. The committee meeting, I think, did its job. It's a bit strange. I don't know if anyone had the chance to watch Prime Minister's questions yesterday. I think it was a bit kind of odd, but it is a way of Parliament holding ministers to account. That's what Parliament is there for. And I certainly felt on our Select Committee this morning, and that was televised on the Parliament channel, that we were able to get our questions across, and the ministers had the opportunity to provide their answers.
Well, we're going to talk more about the current situation and more in particular about your current position as chair for the Works and Pension Committee. According to reports, in the 6 weeks up to 12th of April, 1.5 million people applied for universal credit, and around 560,000 people have had advance payments processed since 16th of March. Minhaj Welfare Foundation as an organization is working tirelessly to support those affected by COVID-19. There's various other organizations, there's food banks, there's faith groups working tirelessly to support those affected. What's your take on the current situation, especially being an MP, working and living in a very multicultural society? What's been the response from your constituents and across the country?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is a lot of people in our community and across the country are having a pretty hard time at the moment. People's jobs have stopped, their work has dried up, their income has stopped in many cases, and obviously that is making life very hard for lots of people. Now, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, thankfully, has come forward with some proposals to help. There's the 80% wage subsidy for workers who've been furloughed. That's going to help a lot of people. There is the support for self-employed people, although that won't start to kick in until June at the earliest, but hopefully that'll cover many and help many people as well. But the truth is there are lots of people who won't be covered by either of those schemes. And for many of them, the one thing they will be able to do is apply for universal credit. And that's really what we were pursuing in our committee meeting this morning. How are things going with universal credit? And I'll be very pleased to talk about that if you'd like to in the course of this discussion. But there's one point I want to emphasize here. There are quite a lot of people in our community who can't apply for universal credit either. That is a large number of people who are working here legally. They've got a visa and everything that they're doing is completely legal. They've got jobs, but their jobs have stopped, as many people's have. And because their visa is stamped with the words "no recourse to public funds," they can't apply for universal credit either. So that's really a big part of the reason why there is so much hardship in our community, because there's such a large group of people. I don't know how many it is, but we're certainly talking about thousands who are not allowed to apply even for universal credit. As you rightly said, 1.5 million people have applied for universal credit over the last few weeks. That means the number of people in the country is twice now what it was 6 weeks ago. It was 1.5 million, now it's 3 million. We can talk about what universal credit does for you, whether it helps you or not, and there are some issues to be raised there. But let's bear in mind there are lots of people who can't claim universal credit either, and that's why the work that the Minhaj Welfare Foundation and others are doing in our community is so important and so welcome.
I just wanted to touch upon your role today in the morning and just touch upon the select committee hearing. And obviously, as a chairman, you have great responsibility to hold ministers and the Secretary of State accountable for their policies, for their discussions. There was a bit of back and forth in terms of the MPs with regards to some administrative delay on universal credit. How are you holding our ministers accountable for the job they're doing?
Well, first of all, on delays, the worst thing about universal credit, in my view, is the fact that after you apply for it, you have to wait for 5 weeks for your first regular benefit payment. And I think that is really unacceptable. Ever since the 1940s, we've had a system in Britain where if you need Social Security, you lose your job, whatever it is, you can apply for help and you'll get your first regular payment within a few days. With universal credit, which is benefiting now from all the computer power and so on that's available, you don't get the first payment within a few days. You have to wait 5 weeks for it. And that really is forcing an awful lot of people into great hardship, debt, not the least of the problems, right at the start of their benefit claim. Now, we, of course, raise this very regularly in Parliament. What the ministers say is, but don't worry, we'll give you an advance. And that's true. They can give you an advance. And as you pointed out earlier, we heard at the committee meeting this morning, over 500,000 people have had an advance of those who've applied, the 1.5 million who've applied in the last few weeks. The problem if you get an advance, though, is you then have to pay it back. So it gets taken out of your later benefit payments. And that's what's causing so much hardship for people, because they get behind with their rent. They're maybe borrowing from others to try and make ends meet. And that is by far, in my view, the worst problem about universal credit. And as you say, we raised it this morning. We will keep on raising it. In fact, the committee has announced that our first major inquiry is going to be focused specifically on this problem of the 5-week delay in universal credit. Our view is that delay should be scrapped. What the ministers said today, and they've said it before, is that even if they wanted to scrap the 5-week delay, it would take ages to change the computer system in order to do it. And I must say, I find that a pretty pathetic excuse. One of the members of the committee this morning said that's the computer says no, is what the minister is saying. And really, you can't, in our view, run public services on that basis. In terms, though, of delivering on what the system is supposed to be doing at the moment, where the Department for Work and Pensions is feeling quite pleased for itself, I think, is that the system hasn't collapsed. They've had 1.5 million people, 10 times the level of average applications for universal credit, and the system has delivered on the whole. There was a period when people were having to wait for ages on the phones and so on, but we seem to have got over that now. So I think, it is fair for the department to say that the universal credit system has withstood the pressure and is doing what it's supposed to be doing. And, I think it's reasonable to give them, to recognise that is not an insignificant achievement.
Based upon I think it was the health advisor to the government who was talking about social distancing prolonging for a much longer period. 1.6 million is a figure that I mentioned, and then the 560,000 that have applied in such a short period. What are expectations that it could go higher than this over the next 2 to 3 months? And what places or what things are government putting into place to cater for that? If such human errors are being done right now, then what will happen if the number increases tenfold?
Well, as I say, the system, the computer system which universal credit runs on, is doing what it's supposed to do at the moment. Our criticisms are that it really ought to be doing some different things. It ought not to be keeping people waiting for 5 weeks for their first regular benefit payment. But that's not the system doing something it shouldn't do. That's what the ministers have told it to do. And that's why there's the problem. So in terms of what it's supposed to do, the universal credit system is holding up reasonably well at the moment, and better than many people expected. I'm sure the numbers claiming will go up. I mean, in a regular week, they handle 55,000 applications. So we're certainly expecting the number of people on universal credit will continue to go up. Increasingly, people who've been on the old benefits, job seekers allowance, employment and support allowance, when their circumstances change, or people coming on to benefit for the first time, all of them will go on to universal credit in the future, not onto the older benefits. So the numbers certainly will continue to rise, and I hope what we're going to see is that the system will continue to cope. And so far, there's no reason to expect that it won't cope. As I say, our criticisms as a committee are that the system is being told to do the wrong thing. It's being told to keep people waiting for 5 weeks for their first regular benefit payment, and our view is that's wrong.
Thank you, Stephen. I just want to give an opportunity to our viewers and listeners. I know there's a large number of people tuned into this Facebook and YouTube live broadcast. You can ask, or add a query, or add a statement to ask, or provide some information to Stephen Timms. And we have a question here, Stephen, from Mariam Tahir. thank you so much for your quick response on your email. It's really appreciated. Your team are amazing. I would like to ask, is there any news for asylum seekers who don't have the leave to remain? This is a question from Mariam Tahir.
Yeah, well, it's affecting Mariam and it's affecting many other people as well. But I mean, as everybody knows, I think the Home Office is very, very slow in deciding these applications. I don't know when Mariam applied for asylum, but it is taking the Home Office much too long to decide applications, and people are left in limbo for a long time while they're waiting to hear. I haven't heard any news about a change in the period. Of course, there are some meetings and interviews that used to happen in the past which won't be happening at the moment because of social isolation and so on. But I haven't heard any news that the process for deciding asylum applications has been sped up or that it's been slowed down. If anyone does think it's changed in that way, I'd be very interested to know about that. And it's certainly something that I'd be very happy to investigate if anyone would like me to. So Mariam is telling us she applied in October 2018. So that's about a year and a half ago. Well, yeah, I mean, by now there ought to have been a decision. I think what I'd say to Mariam is, if I'm your MP, please email me and I'll gladly investigate on your behalf, ask the Home Office what's going on, and I'm sure whoever your MP is, they'll be, if it's not me, they'll be happy to do the same. It's useful to have your Home Office reference number as well when we make that inquiry. But yeah, it's still taking too long.
Thank you so much for that, Stephen. And just if you do want to ask a question to our viewers, please do state where you are calling from or where you're listening from. We've got a really massive worldwide audience at this very moment of time.
Can I just mention a point,
yes, of course, Stephen.
Adnan, just about universal credit, something that crosses my mind that might be of relevance to people listening to this program. I know there are some people in our community who they've been affected by the crisis. They saw the government publicity. They thought, well, maybe I should apply for universal credit. But in fact, they are people who were already receiving working tax credits. Now, if you're already getting tax credits, you should not apply for universal credit, because what people weren't aware of is that when you apply for universal credit, you automatically lose your tax credits. And for many people, you're actually getting more from tax credits than you're going to get from universal credit. So if you're on tax credit at the moment, if you're on working tax credit, almost always the best thing is to stick with that and don't apply for universal credit.
Is anything changed in the pension process during this period?
No, the pension process is carrying on pretty much as always. Of course, the state pension age is steadily going up, as it has been for a while. That's a fairly long planned rise, although particularly for some women born in the early 1950s, unfortunately, the government didn't give adequate notice of what they were proposing, and so that many of those now should-be pensioners have been caught out. There are worries for some pension funds that, because of uncertainty in the financial markets and so on, there are worries that they might struggle a bit more to meet their liabilities in the future than they have been up till now. But I don't think that's an immediate worry. On the whole, on the pension side of things, things are continuing as as everybody would hope, and I'm sure many people would like to see higher pensions, but there isn't any disruption really that's hitting people who are claiming pensions at the moment.
Stephen, one of the most vulnerable communities we see are those who have a disability, and obviously there's a massive discussion on the disability allowance. I was wondering if you could shed further light onto this as well.
Yeah, well, we covered that in our meeting this morning. It's a very, very important topic. One of the points that we made this morning is, surely if universal credit has gone up, and it's gone up by about £20 a week in response to the crisis. Housing support has gone up considerably, and that's very helpful. surely support for disabled people should have gone up as well. The level of disability living allowance or personal independence payment, which is the replacement for disability living allowance, you'd think they ought to have gone up as well. Employment and support allowance, the benefit for people who are out of work on health grounds, surely that should have gone up, but it hasn't. And I think the committee was absolutely right to raise that this morning.
I think, Stephen, we've just lost you at the moment. Sorry, can you hear me, Stephen? No. We're just having a slight technical issue. We're just trying to resolve this technical. I'm sure we can get our team to just sort that out as well. I think we'll just try to sort that out, and we'll just no. Yeah, that's better. That's better. Yep, I can hear you now, Stephen. Yep.
You can hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
How far I got. But I say the committee was making the point this morning, my colleague Debbie Abrahams in particular, that surely benefits for disabled people should have been increased as well. They haven't been. There is a question here about what's happening to new applications for personal independence payment. The Minister assured us this morning that if you apply now for personal independence payment, your benefit will be processed in the normal way and you shouldn't have to wait longer than normal to get your benefit. There are reports of some people having been told, sorry, we're not processing any applications for 3 months. So I'm hoping that we can get to the bottom of that and make sure that if there is a delay facing some people, it'll be resolved.
So I'm sure you just read this question just for our viewers. Khalid Javed, as an entrepreneur, what can they do to escape the current economic crisis without approaching government's grants or assistance? That was a question for Stephen, and I'm sure.
Well, let me say first of all, I don't think anyone should feel embarrassed about accepting government grants or assistance. The government has taken the decision that in order to reduce the likely loss of life from this crisis, we all need to self-isolate, to do social distancing, in many cases to stay at home. That is the government's decision, and the government recognises that to minimise the economic damage from that, it's got to give support to entrepreneurs, to businesses, to self-employed people, to companies with employees. So I think the first thing to say is nobody should feel any embarrassment about approaching and accepting those offers. The government is giving them not out of the kindness of its heart or not because it likes welfare, but to minimize the economic damage to the country. That's the reason that the support is being provided. Because we don't want to be in a position in a couple of months' time, whenever it is, when this crisis eases, that we've got all the businesses have all collapsed. The purpose of the government support is to keep the businesses in place. Having said that, I'm sure there are opportunities that businesses may be able to take to do well in the current climate. There are businesses doing well. Retailing, grocery retailing is doing well. People making online deliveries are doing well. There are opportunities in fashion, and quite a number of interesting opportunities that have opened up. And it may be there are businesses whose previous line of work has effectively ground to a halt because of the crisis, who can move into new opportunities and do well out of them. But not every business is going to be able to do that. And so, as I say, I don't think anyone should feel any embarrassment about accepting the offer of support that the government is making.
I think just to follow on from that, I think a lot of businesses, I think for some businesses, it's a matter of access and an opportunity to find the right kind of opportunity to seek grant applications, whether or not that information is being relayed down to grassroots. Because for many communities, a family-run business runs not just one family; it runs an entire extended family. So everybody is kind of affected. So the question is, are these grants accessible to everybody? And what kind of opportunities are there for small businesses?
Right. Well, are they accessible? I think they're reasonably accessible. I mean, there is bureaucracy attached to them. There are rules around them, and there will be some people who find that they don't meet the conditions for them. So let's not pretend that this is kind of instant money available for everybody, because it isn't. But I suppose the most important grants that are available for small businesses are for businesses in the hospitality sector, where there is a payment that is paid through the local council on the basis of rules that have been set by the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Other businesses whose premises have a rateable value of less than £51,000. So a lot of small businesses, shops, in our community, I know, have benefited from that and are already doing so. There is support under the job retention scheme that the government will pay the wages, or 80% at least of the wages, of staff who have been furloughed by their employer. That is, staff who've been told, sorry, there isn't any work for you at the moment, you've got nothing to do, please go home, and you will receive 80% of your wages from the Treasury. In some cases, the employer will then top up. I think ideally that would always happen. The employer would top up the 20%, but at least you'll get 80%, even if the employer isn't doing the top up. So that's the job retention scheme that the Chancellor has introduced. And then the other major scheme is the self-employed support scheme, where basically the government says, what has your self-employed income been over the last 3 years? And one of the problems is you've got to have been self-employed for 3 years in order to qualify for this. Then the government will support your income for the coming few months on the basis of what you've earned, what your tax claims have been previously. So those are the main sources of provision. There are other schemes. There was one just announced a couple of days ago for technology startups. And I dare say the government is going to come up with more help for different groups in the future. So this is changing the whole time. The details of it are all set out on the gov.uk web portal under coronavirus. That's the where all the guidance that the government has published will appear.
I think a lot of questions which have come in terms of discussion is obviously one of the announcements we heard from the Chancellor of the Exchequer, especially for the charitable sector and those working in charities, was the announcement of £750 million. Now, for many charities, is this a sufficient amount? And I think the question leads on to a more informative aspect in terms of whether or not the grants or the funding which has been laid available to charities or to businesses, whether that's enough to sustain staff, whether that's enough to sustain the charities or businesses. Could more have been laid out by the Chancellor of the Exchequer?
Well, I think a lot of us feel more should be done. Certainly, the package that's been announced is better than nothing, because to begin with, we had nothing. So it is definitely a step in the right direction. I don't think it is going to be enough. And, you know, it's just worth underlining the extent to which at the moment it is charities, it is faith groups, it's mosques, it's gurdwaras, it's churches who are really keeping many, many families going at the moment, families who otherwise would have no food at all and would be in a terrible situation. I think some families actually will be in a terrible situation because the help hasn't yet reached them. And if there is anyone in that situation, I hope they'll let you know, Adnan, so that steps can be taken to provide them with help. One point to make about charities is that they do qualify for the 80% wage subsidy if their employees are furloughed. If there's nothing for them to do at the moment and they're going to stop working, then the government will pay 80% of their wages. And it's important that charities take full advantage of that if they are able to. But I am worried that there are some really great charities that have been doing a fantastic job who, if there isn't more help forthcoming, may not survive this pandemic crisis. And that would be tragic if we lost their support and their help as a result.
Stephen, the first 30 minutes we talked about some policies. I just wanted to focus the next 30 minutes more on the impact of the financial and economic crisis that we're all facing and that we're all expecting over the next couple of months, especially on low-income families and generally on society. You've been an MP for many years and you've held many positions. Recently, you were one of our guests at the antisocial behavior conference that we organized in London. We're seeing a massive rise in some sort of antisocial behavior. Before I move to that question, there's just a question from a Nisar Ahmadar. Obviously, our viewers come first before I get to ask a question. Can a private employee or self-employed person claim wages from the government during pandemic? That's a question from Nisar Ahmadar.
Right. Well, the answer is, let's take those two separately and start with the self-employed. Can the self-employed claim wages from the government during this crisis? The answer to that is yes. There is a self-employed support scheme, which the Chancellor of the Exchequer has announced. It hasn't started paying out yet. It looks as though it's going to be at least June before it does start to pay out. But if you're self-employed, if you've been self-employed for at least 3 years and have got have made tax forms, have completed tax forms showing your self-employed income over the last 3 years, then yes, you can claim, and the Treasury will support you, give you support to cover you for the period of this crisis. So that's the position for self-employed people. Of course, it's very hard if there are people who gave up their job a few weeks ago in order to become self-employed. So they haven't got records going back 3 years, and so they're not going to be eligible for this scheme. So there are big gaps in it, but nevertheless, it's going to help quite a lot of people. If you're an employee, no, you cannot directly claim wages from the government if you are an employee, but it may well be, if you're not working at the moment, if your employer has told you, sorry, there's no work for you, I'm therefore going to furlough you, is the technical term used, which just means you can stay at home at the moment. Your employer then can claim for 80% of your wages, including on costs. So that includes national insurance, it includes pension contributions as well. 80% of all of that can be claimed by your employer from the government, so that the employer can pay the employee then the 80% of their wage. And a lot of employers are making up the difference to pay up to the 100% from their own resources. And obviously, if that's possible, then that's preferable. But the government at least is paying 80% to the employer to make sure that those wages can be passed on to the employee.
I just wanted to, before I move on to the question, you mentioned furloughed a couple of times. Just very briefly, for many, this is a new term, and it's being banished amongst many circles. Is it as easy as people say, sitting at home and just getting some money in?
Is it easy? Well, I think that depends on the circumstances. I mean, being at home can be a kind of quite a stressful thing. So it really depends on the circumstances people find themselves in. We've got a lot of people in our community where you've got a family living in a room, you've got other families living in other rooms in the same house, so you're supposed to keep your social distance, but if you're sharing a bathroom or sharing a kitchen, that can be a pretty difficult thing to do. I know families in Newham where you've got mum, dad, 5 children in a 1-bedroom flat. That's pretty hard to be in that situation sort of 23 hours per day. So no, it's not easy. I mean, for some people, no doubt, it is the opportunity to have a rest, I suppose, but for many it isn't, and it could be quite a stressful period.
I think following on from just the point that you made and something that we were talking about, especially the impact that we see from this economic crisis and coronavirus, we've seen a rise in a number of antisocial behavior. There's been a number of key aspects within discussions that have been going on the mental health state of individuals and how this might have an impact, not just on communities or households, but the wider community. How's government, or how as an MP are you looking into this, and what can you advise for communities and our viewers and listeners out there?
Well, it's worth making the point, I think, first of all, Adnan, that actually crime is down. The last conversation I had with our local police, burglary, those sort of crimes are quite significantly down at the moment compared with how they were before the crisis, maybe 40% down. So on that front, it's not all bad news, but there has been an increase in some antisocial behaviour problems. There's been an increase, I'm afraid, in domestic violence. Maybe that's predictable. It's certainly deeply regrettable. I was speaking this week to Refuge, which is the organisation which runs hostels for victims of domestic violence. They're seeing a big increase in the caseload that they're dealing with, perhaps reflecting the extra pressure in households. And I think that there is going to be a rise in problems with mental health. If you're cooped up in pretty unsatisfactory situations at home for days on end, it's not surprising that it does take a bit of a toll on your mental health. And I think we have to make sure that the health service is able to continue to support people with mental health problems, as well as, of course, dealing with this massive new pandemic problem that's suddenly hit us. One of the members of our committee, Dr. Ben Spencer, a Conservative MP, was a mental health doctor at St Thomas's Hospital until he was elected to Parliament in December. And I know he spent some time going back to the hospital, doing some shifts in his old job. So, they are short of people, not surprisingly. And we need to make sure they've got the resources that they need to do the best possible job to provide support that people urgently need during this crisis, not just with the pandemic itself, but with other aspects of our health as well.
But with the aspect of social distancing, and this is where charities and faith groups play a vital role in the spiritual, in the physical support, in providing additional helping hands to those affected. With the current situation of COVID-19, Ramadan is coming. The mosques are closed apparently. What actions can mosques play and charities play in supporting those affected?
Well, I know there is a lot of ingenuity being thought about for how people can meet together virtually to break the fast, to do the things that the community always does at this period of the year. And I think that's got to be the answer. I mean, I don't know about you, Adnan, I hadn't heard of Zoom 6 weeks ago, I don't think. And now I seem to spend my life in Zoom meetings of one sort or another. Suddenly we're finding all these technological solutions which we didn't know about before, and we've got to make use of them. It is really important to observe the social distancing obligations that have been set by the government. They're not doing it out of spite. They're doing it to keep as many of us safe and healthy as possible. I've been a bit upset to see sometimes in our parks in East Ham, people not observing the social distancing requirements. And the problem with that is if you do flout those obligations, you put yourself in danger, you put others in danger as well. I think we need to support each other and stick to the rules. And as you say, that does mean not gathering in the mosque for iftar this year as in normal years.
Stephen, we've just got a question from Faisal Hussein, and his question is how can companies or businesses, charities claim or be compensated on loss of income or donations? It's not just payroll, but also other fixed costs that would have a knock-on impact or effect on the overall business, as well as charitable projects which survive on the kind contributions and donations. I think, as you're well aware, in Ramadan, it's reported that the Muslim population are the most giving. So I think a couple of points which is mentioned are very valid, and that's for yourself, Stephen.
Yes, well, I think in Ramadan, normally well over £100 million is given by Muslims to charity. And it may well be that those donations will be down this year because people are not in the places where the donations have typically been collected. It's important to make the point, to repeat the point, that charities are eligible to claim under the government's job retention scheme. So if a charity puts its workers on furlough, says to its workers, we've got nothing for you to do at the moment, please stay at home, then the charity can claim 80% of their wage costs from the Treasury. That is a facility that the government is providing, and charities need to take advantage of that. On top of that, there is a £750 million fund that you mentioned earlier, Adnan. And again, I think charities should be taking advantage of that if they can. Now, those things between them are not going to cover the full loss that many charities are suffering at the moment. And I don't think anyone is pretending that the government will take all of the hit itself. It won't, it couldn't, and it won't. But it is important that where charities are seeing losses of that kind, that they take advantage of what limited support that the government has provided.
Stephen, thank you so much. We've just got another 5 more minutes, and again, we open the questions to and queries to our viewers online on Facebook and YouTube. If there's any questions in regards to the title of our live program today, Quarantine, Economic Crisis and the Impact on Low-Income Families or Society as a whole, please do ask your questions via Facebook and YouTube. You can add your comments on Facebook and YouTube. And Stephen Timms, who's the Member of Parliament for East Ham and also the Chair of the Work and Pensions Committee, he'll try his best to answer your questions, or I'm sure we'll be able to take your questions or queries further towards the select committee. Stephen, one of the things that we've realized, especially during this time of economic crisis, is the impact on low income families. Your experience as treasurer and working with the Treasury recently in the Labour government, it's possibly having a larger impact on low income families. What solutions are government looking at to support those from marginalized communities and those who are literally surviving on food banks? And with the shortage of food banks in terms of supplies, how are they going to manage, basically?
Well, somebody told me today that we now have 32 food banks in Newham, which is a huge number and a much larger number than just a few weeks ago. So it is remarkable how the charities, the faith groups have come together to support our community as a whole through this time. And I can only pay tribute to them. In fact, together with the MP for West Ham, Lynn Brown, the Mayor of Newham, Roxana Fiaz, and Mesh Desai, our representative on the Greater London Assembly, we've sent a letter this week to One Newham, the umbrella organisation, for the voluntary sector in Newham, just to say thank you to everybody for the fantastic job that they're doing. And I hope that letter will be very widely circulated. It's sincerely meant on our part. We can only admire and be grateful for the fantastic community response that we've seen. But one of the things that our committee is going to do, as we've been discussing, we have been looking at universal credit, how that holds up to the job that it needs to do. But we also need to address the question, after the crisis, how are we going to recover? Because it may well be that at the end of this crisis, despite the schemes the government is putting in place, partly because of the holes in those schemes, there will be a lot of people who haven't got jobs. There'll be a big recovery needed in order to get back on our feet. And so our committee is going to want to look at what the Department for Work and Pensions, what the job centres need to do to get low-income families back on their feet after this crisis. Hopefully universal credit will support people through it, the big exception being those who've got no recourse to public funds. But after the crisis, how do we help people get back on their feet, get back to work, earning for themselves again, able to support themselves and their families? That's the crucial job that will need to be done beyond the crisis itself. And that's certainly something that our committee is looking to investigate. We're going to talk on Monday actually about what we'll be doing in May, but that's my view, and other members of the committee feel the same, that looking at that question, how do we get people back to work after this crisis? That's going to be an important part of our job in the coming month.
Stephen, thank you so much for giving your time. We're really grateful.
Thank you for having me.
Is there a final word that you would like to give to our viewers and our listeners out there with regards to quarantining, to COVID-19, and how we can use our time effectively during this period?
Well, this is a very hard time for everybody, a hard time for our community. I'd want to underline again the importance of observing the rules and obligations that have been imposed on us to keep ourselves safe during this time, to observe the social distancing rules when we go shopping and out in the high street and in the parks. I'd also want to wish everybody, despite these problems, a very, very peaceful Ramadan period. And say to everyone that we are going to get out of this. It is going to be behind us at some point, I hope before too long. Let's continue to support each other in our community. Thank you to Minhaj Welfare Foundation for everything you're doing. We're very grateful to faith groups throughout our community for the contribution that they're making, really keeping many, many people going at the moment. Thank you for that. Let's continue to work together for a safe period for our community through this crisis, and for a happier time in the future for all of us ahead.
Stephen Timms, MP for East Ham and Chair for the Works and Pensions Committee, thank you so much for your valuable time.
Thank you for
we hope to
inviting
meet you
me.
soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was Stephen Timms, the MP for East Ham and Chair of the Works and Pensions Committee. You can follow this on our Facebook page and YouTube link. If there's any further questions that you have or any concerns that you have, please do send it to Minhaj Welfare Foundation. Remember, Minhaj Welfare Foundation was amongst the first charities to basically launch COVID-19 UK campaign. We are working with council groups, charity sectors, and other organizations to support all people, the vulnerable communities here in the UK. Our teams and volunteers are working in Manchester, in Birmingham, in London, in Glasgow, Walsall, Bradford. So we're working alongside individuals and people within government to ensure that your word and your messages are heard. We're here as an organization to provide support to those who do not have the right kind of information about what's currently happening economically here in this country. At the same time, Minhaj Welfare Foundation, as you're well aware, Ramadan will be announced very soon. So whenever Ramadan is announced, we do wish everybody a Ramadan Mubarak. But most importantly, please, an appeal to all our listeners and viewers out there: do donate your zakat, your sadaqah, and charity to Minhaj Welfare Foundations, whose responsibility is to ensure that we deliver your aid to the most neediest of people around the world who are suffering at this very moment of time, who don't have access to food, clean water, who need your kind support. So once again, thank you to all our listeners, and inshallah, until next time, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you very much. You're welcome. Thank you. God bless you. Bye-bye.